Committee Room 30. Sound.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. So members, we are broadcast online and throughout the Parliament buildings, and I just welcome anyone who's watching online. If you could just keep your mobile phones muted and no recording during proceedings. Okay, happy to proceed. So in terms of apologies, we haven't received any today, and I think we're still waiting for Emma to join us online, but she's just gone too, so she should be here shortly. Oh, there's Emma now. Emma, I'm just wondering, can you hear us? Okay, she's logging in. Okay, we'll move on. Okay, so in terms of declaration of interest, has anybody got any that'd like to declare? No? Okay. Okay, so in terms of Chairperson's business, members, we had anticipated the First Minister and Deputy First Minister coming before committee next week to give us an update on their areas of responsibility. But we received a letter late last night advising that they aren't coming and are seeking a date for a session in after recess, so obviously in September time, and they've also asked for an informal meeting with Connie and me as Chair and Deputy Chair, so we're looking into that at the minute, and that would hopefully take place before we move into recess. I would imagine that the junior ministers will be at that as well, that informal briefing, but it's just a note that we still haven't had a session with them in committee session yet. Okay, so moving on then, so we will be looking then, in the absence of the First Minister and Deputy First Minister coming next week, we're looking again to see what we can, fill that space in terms of next week's meeting. So we want to set up the arrangements for summer recess now to be agreed in case things don't come together next week. So members, the committee will continue to receive correspondence from stakeholders over the summer period, and it will be standard practice that the committee team include such items for consideration in the committee's first meeting pack for the new session in September, unless there are urgent matters. And so again, it'll be standard practice to delegate authority to the Chairperson and Deputy Chairperson during the summer recess period to submit views on the releasing or withholding of information of any non-routine or contentious freedom of information requests received by the committee, and that any such views expressed would be brought to the attention of the committee at the first meeting after recess. Are members content to delegate this authority? Yep. Okay, thank you. Okay, moving on quickly then, in terms of draft minutes, these are found in your meeting pack on pages 7 to 11, and just checking that people feel that they're a true record. Okay, so if you're content, I'll go ahead and sign those. Any matters arising? No? Okay. Okay, so we'll move on with our evidence session for today. So this is on the donation of bodies for anatomical research, and we're going to receive an oral briefing from Truth Recovery NI. So welcome to our meeting. We have got Ewan Duffy, who's a member of Truth Recovery NI, if you'd like to come forward. Okay. So just while Ewan's taking a seat there, members, you'll find the clerk's brief on page 14 of your pack. Page 16 will be the briefing paper from Truth Recovery NI, and then there are other papers also found in your pack. So welcome, Ewan, good to see you at committee today, and thank you for submitting your information in advance. And if you'd just like to make some opening remarks, please.
Yeah, thanks very much, Paula. I'd just like to thank the committee for this opportunity to speak today. Firstly, this is yet another layer to the whole realm of the mother and baby institutional issues that was outlined in the briefing paper, for example, there about how my interest was flagged around the Commission's report in the south of Ireland in 2019, to be specific. So in terms of what I've been trying to do then on the back of that interest, I had brought that interest across the border here to Northern Ireland to see what, if any, universities may be involved in the same sort of issues. It turns out that Queen's University in Belfast then was, I think, probably the only university with its own medical and anatomical department. So I'd just like to start by saying that I suppose the major significant aspects of an ongoing process, which is now 5 years in the making. What I did initially then was to start sending freedom of information requests to Queen's University to try and ascertain whether or not the anatomical issues were relevant in Northern Ireland as well. As it turns out, that was the case. So over a number of years then, I extracted a lot of information that Queen's University provided around the fact that a number of institutions, including mother and baby, and the workhouses, were indeed a case of where adults, babies and children were then taken for those institutions when they had died and used by Queen's University then for research and teaching purposes. Since then, I've tried to emphasise the importance being involved in these mother and baby institutional issues, workhouses and Magdalen laundries, that it's highly important. A major significant aspect of it is trying to trace people's loved ones that have, in some cases, effectively disappeared over time, and the anatomical issues break into the same sort of environment in that respect. I have made it very, very clear to Queen's University now in virtually 18 months of engagement that we need some kind of a public awareness campaign on this, because the general public would not be aware of this particular aspect and how it would affect the tracing of people that have disappeared, people that have died and belong to certain people. Queen's have so far pushed back on that and basically said that because they're now trying to create a digital database, that they think it would be better holding back on that media awareness. And even public disclosure apparently is a bit of a touchy subject as well, where they're now taking counsel from the truth recovery process and their own legal advisors as to what they can actually publicly disclose. I've tried to talk about the urgency in making the general public aware that the anatomical issues at Queen's University could potentially be a first port of call for anyone that's trying to find out what happened to their loved ones and mitigate against years and decades of trying to search for somebody. So that's an ongoing process, something that I would like expedited as quickly as possible, to be honest with you. The committee wouldn't have been aware 3 weeks ago when it took a briefing from the independent panel and the researchers that actually Sinead had brought up about the fact that the anatomical issues had not been brought up in the latest interim report. The committee wouldn't have been aware actually that Professor Sean O'Connell would not have been permitted to discuss these anatomical issues in front of the committee because of a conflict of interest that I raised initially at the start of this process. I was told by the Executive Office that Sean O'Connell, when it came to discussing these anatomical issues, would have to step out of the meetings. And I find that absolutely laughable, to be honest with you, because obviously the minutes of the meetings would be available, he'd be talking to other people on the panel, and he'd be aware of the anatomical issues. And as an employee of Queen's University, I said you might as well bring in the PSNI, members of the religious orders to the truth recovery process and the independent panel then, if that's the way you're going to treat it. So, as of that meeting, the Queen's University meeting that I had with them on the 13th of May, Queen's says that there's no information on private burials, nor would that information be sought, given the nature of the fact that there were private burials. I sent you guys some samples of the data that I received from Queen's University, and over the extensive data that I was given, bearing in mind this is people we're talking about, there was 1,980 remains that were used by Queen's University. 1,824 are outstanding in terms of what has happened to the remains of those people. I think it's incumbent that we not only try and expedite an investigation into this, which the committee previously in the last mandate had called for. I don't think we can wait on a statutory inquiry for this, because this is going to take too long. And again, just to emphasise the fact that people will be waiting. There are a lot of people that are affected by this issue in terms of anatomical issues that won't even be aware of it so far. The other thing I'd like to bring up that hasn't been investigated in the north of Ireland and in any processes so far are drug and vaccine trials. The Queen's University research, Ulster University research, did not investigate these. The Commission's report in the south of Ireland listed GlaxoSmithKline trials between 1934 and 73. These were childhood vaccines and milk trials for babies. Consent was again dispensed with. And I made an approach to GlaxoSmithKline in 2018 about my own circumstances to see whether or not I was subjected to any kind of drug vaccine trial when I was in Marionville in Newry. And they got back and told me that because the trials weren't published, it was highly unlikely that I was subjected to a trial, which is completely unacceptable. Since then, I just want to finish off by saying that drug and vaccine trials are a widespread issue on the entire 32 counties of Ireland. GlaxoSmithKline have been given impunity in terms of what they carried out over an expensive period in the south of Ireland and all of those trials. We don't want that to happen up here. I was given information by GlaxoSmithKline as well when I made my approach to them that 44 children in an unnamed children's residential institution here in 1962 were subjected to a drug and vaccine trial. GlaxoSmithKline could not confirm what that institution was. I think that needs investigated because there are potential long-term, long-standing consequences of anyone that was subjected to a drug and vaccine trial. And I think that's something we need to look into. The PSNI made the same approach to GSK and they were told the exact same thing. So there's no defined children's institution, and we know that has the potential to be rolled out across the mother and baby institutions and baby institutions in general. And yes, if you could just bear with me, Paula, have another couple of minutes.
Yeah.
In the briefing, the last page, I had talked about implicit dispute. So if you just bear with me and give me a minute or two just to read out some extracts of those paragraphs. So implicit dispute throughout the core of institutional issues runs a common thread of impropriety, lack of or no consent, coercion, moral bankruptcy, legal loopholes and enforced situations of disappearances, family separation and hard labour, whilst in different stages of pregnancy, and a host of other egregious harms and violations on the living and on the dead. Rights to humanity and citizenship are enshrined in secular and religious culture and society. Implicit dispute happens when a person dies, their body enters medical research and teaching culture, but informed consent is implied, never documented in full for the bereaved. The unsaid, the unknowing, the non-consent demeans the integrity and the dignity of the dead, and it leaves the potential for infinite unjustified guilt for those left behind, to grieve the loss and to remember. Once a body enters that body supply and demand system, it makes it difficult to track and trace what is happening or has happened to the parts of our loved ones. Recent news tells us that malpractice and immoral treatment of our dead still goes on. Truth, justice, disclosure, accountability, responsibility, rectification, memorialisation, various forms of redress and reparations are common aims of those affected, but with varying priorities. We ask and demand that the government and its officials write a better history and ensure that their individual and collective legacy is something to embolden their own pride and integrity and leave a lasting trail of hope and positive impact on the people in the here and now and the generations to come. Thank you, and I'm obviously open to questions.
Oh, thank you so much, Ewan. I really appreciate that. I'll just kick off with some questions at the start then. So, in terms of, sounded like you've been engaging right up until recent months with Queen's University, and sorry, I should have said they were invited today, but they didn't have anyone available. So we will come back to that. So, but Queen's is in my constituency, and I'm particularly keen to find out about your engagement at the minute in terms of any progress you feel that you're making in this space.
Okay, Paul, thank you.
Do you want to answer? Yeah.
Suppose the engagement then has covered a range of issues. I have impressed upon them, given the data that I've received about the number of people that they've used on their records, apparently starting from 1927, and this is up until 1989 when I shut down my FOI requests. There's massive aspects in terms of what has happened to the anatomical remains of the people that were used. This is adults, children and babies, some of which came from mother and baby institutions, specifically Thorndale House, which was a mother and baby institution and an industrial school run by the Salvation Army. I have impressed upon them the fact, as I've said already, about the need for the general public to know that if they are now affected or potentially affected in the future, that Queen's University is that first avenue and that first port of call for a lot of people to approach Queen's University and, by a system of elimination even, saying, was my relative used by the university for any kind of anatomical research or teaching? As I said, they're pushing back on that. I would like that expedited ASAP. We've talked about memorialisation. Last year they'd said that they were hoping to get something more concrete and the process pushed further along by the end of this term. That hasn't really happened. There will be memorialisation paid for by Queen's University on the grounds of Queen's University and potentially in Belfast City Cemetery and Roselawn Cemetery as well. Queen's have confirmed that those two cemeteries belonging to the council are the only two cemeteries where they have established and owned graves and plots by themselves. I have said that doesn't help the case for the defence in their case, because there are over 1,800 people that are effectively disappeared and missing at the minute. And Queen's have told me that, in their words, there's a deficit in the records, which there will always be. And I have says, well, that's a pretty big deficit that you guys have to try and close, because, as it says, out of 1,980 people, they have very few graves and plots in Belfast City Cemetery and Roselawn that are effectively owned by them and used by them. As you've seen in the briefing, there are many unanswered questions here in terms of how many remains or body parts. And excuse me, I mean, some people might find this quite disturbing, even talking about this. This is a very unpalatable subject, but unfortunately it's a reality and a truth that we have to deal with when it comes to these issues. So there's the potential for several body parts, whatever they may be, being on a massive basis actually being used in one single coffin. Now, they've confirmed to me, without any kind of documented evidence, that there's only one individual remains in each coffin. All I have says, well, are we talking then about inquests and exhumations to establish exactly how many people or body parts might be in every single coffin? Because out of 1,980 people, there's only 1,824 that they can stand over, and that's a massive gap. So.
Okay, so I fully appreciate that the Queens aren't here today, so we will be picking this stuff up, especially around the public awareness campaign that you referenced, Ewan. You talked about the that sort of information, the lack of information, about private burials, and calling for an investigation, and I can't wait for the inquiry. And when the departmental officials were here a few weeks ago, I had said, and you were one of them, you've been talking about a public inquiry for 10, 12, 14 years now, but the public inquiry would be the vehicle through which there would be that requirement for people to come forward, and I would be concerned that the likes of Queen's and others maybe won't be as forthcoming if it was just like an inquisitorial inquiry as opposed to a public statutory inquiry. So why would you be wanting to push for something that wouldn't have as much teeth or as much force whenever the public inquiry is forthcoming anyway?
Yeah, I totally understand that, Paula, and I would say that if Queens have nothing to hide, then why do they need to wait? That's the basic premise here, is that if you're being fully transparent and open, and there's integrity in and around, and I said to Queens at the very start, I was never here to attack the integrity of a body donation scheme. We all know how important biomedical science is, etc. But if we wait for a public inquiry, how many people are going to be affected in the here and now? How many people are looking for people now, potentially looking for people already for decades? So do we keep pushing them back? That public inquiry, we haven't even drawn up legislation for it yet. Yeah. How long is that going to take? And then how long will the public inquiry take? How long will it get round to actually investigating the issues around Queen's University? And I say to people, I mean, it seems a bit of a shame, and it's not a good case for the defence when the religious orders, Queen's University, all of these institutions are being forced by compulsion, by statutory compulsion, to come to the witness box and defend themselves and provide the access to information. And that seems to be the case, unfortunately, so far for too many organisations that are under charge and under scrutiny.
Okay, I'll move on to Deputy Chair. Go ahead, Connie, please.
Thank you so much for coming in today, Ewan. And I think, as you said, it's not a nice subject, it's not palatable, but it is really, really important. And I appreciate you and the work you've done shining the light on this. And I think I wanted to just hear more about the impact this is really having. And with your group, Truth Recovery, how many families and individuals affected do you engage with, and just the scale of this and the lasting impact this is having on those families and the distress it's causing? If you could talk a bit more about that to really give us that human element.
Yeah, thanks, Connie. I suppose with all of these institutional issues, one thing that I've tried to impress on the independent panel and its work and for the future inquiry is a need for awareness around psychological trauma, around intergenerational trauma on every level that has affected the thousands upon thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people up and down the length and breadth of this island. That's north and south. So if you can imagine the distress for people, when I first brought this up at the consultation forum meeting, people were all like, I can't even believe this is yet another layer to this. I mean, anatomical issues, the potential around non-consensual use of dead bodies for anatomical research and teaching. And in your briefing paper, you will see a lot of the things that even a highly, widely criticised commission in the south of Ireland actually brought a lot of this to the fore. And it says a lot, even when that 2019 interim report wasn't even included in the full Commission's report in 2021, how a lot of people want to sweep this under the carpet. And it's unacceptable. It's having such a massive effect on people when I bring in anatomical issues into the fact that we had all of these enforced disappearances, we had coercion, we have lots of people missing, we have unmarked graves, we have so many people that can't be traced, living or dead. The amounts of babies and children that were trafficked to various countries around the world, the impact that's having on people, the long-lasting impact of a child and a mother, two sides of the party that have been separated from birth. Sometimes the baby adoptions, the fostering were already premeditated, and women and girls were put under immense pressure to forcibly give up their babies, sometimes blackmailed that if they didn't give up their babies for adoption, that they would be actually thrown into and incarcerated into one of the many pathways and practices that we call psychiatric and mental asylums as well. Something that, again, has never ever been investigated up and down the length and breadth of Ireland, either the 26 counties or the 6 counties. And these are massive, have massive impact on everybody, unless you're affected by an issue where you don't know what happened to a loved one, you don't know what happened to your mother, you don't know what happened to your siblings. It's very, very hard to understand, no matter how much empathy and compassion you have, what anybody is going through in terms of what they don't know and how that impacts an adopted person, for example, even in terms if you look at your medical history and what may be passed down the line, your genetics, and all the history and culture in the round that. These issues, they're highly complicated. There are many nuances to it, and unfortunately this is what we have to live with, and this is not something I'm a victim survivor myself, and no matter what prerogative any victim survivor or anybody affected by these issues decides to call themselves, the victim don't get the victims in terms of the dead people don't get to choose.
Okay, thank you. Carol, please. Carol, oh, there you go.
Sorry,
That's okay.
just trying. And sorry, I was just keeping camera off because I just keep saying Wi-Fi unstable. So, thank you for coming to committee. It's not easy, and the briefing paper was very, very detailed. And as you said yourself, I just felt a bit distressed reading it all. So I just want to say at the start that I just want to say that we appreciate the detail that you provided. My questions really are relating to, I suppose I raised this at the end of May around public records. And, what is your experience of trying to get access to, if someone had died? Because I seen in your briefing that you provided samples of, what age people were, how they died and all the rest. But for any victim survivor trying to trace what happened, either a sibling or a parent, what has your experience been trying to get access to information, for example, even from PRONI or Religious Orders Union?
Thanks, Carol. That's an ongoing issue, unfortunately, that hasn't been resolved in many ways. The anatomical issues are much like the rest of the issues, but people, I suppose, don't realise that the dead or the deceased actually have little to no rights when it comes to privacy and confidentiality under GDPR and data protection. And this is something that I'm constantly stonewalled with. Even in making my approaches to Roselawn Cemetery, for example, to try and establish what graves and plots that Roselawn owned belonging to Queen's University, I was immediately told by, I suppose, an ordinary member of staff, "Oh, we can't disclose that information because of GDPR." And I says, "Well, actually you can." I says, "And GDPR is not a barrier to access here." I says, "So I'd like the information," because ridiculously, for example, if I was to walk around, or you were to walk around Belfast City Cemetery now, or Roselawn, you will see some of the graves and plots that are attached to Queen's University. Now, there's not a big highlighted memorial or anything like that there, and that's again one thing that I've brought up. It's that if you go and look at some of these plots and graves, you will not see any attachment to Queen's University and the dead people that are there and what that means. Access to information, again, if you look at the data samples that I provided in the briefing, it shows you things around name, not name, date, age, when a person died, and when Queen's University accessed those remains. Queen's stated in the replies to the Executive Committee and to myself that they complied with all conditions of the Anatomy Act. Well, do you know what? They didn't. And some of the information that we require was actually obligated under that Anatomy Act, and Queen's can't provide that information. So they failed in their duties to all of those people that were used, and they're now failing in their duties in terms of disclosure and discovery to people like myself. I actually don't want to be here, to be honest with you, discussing this issue, but being the type of activist, advocate and campaigner that I am, I felt a need, I felt a want, and I felt an obligation to try and find out what had happened up here, just as well as down in the south of Ireland. I was a member of the recent Access to Adoption records group that was a government initiative that was set up over 2 years ago to set up new statutory guidelines and practice for all of the social workers in the 5 health trusts here. Because the 1987 legislation around adoption has been so antiquated and outdated in terms of practice that as part of the truth recovery process, it was suggested we maybe need to look into this here. I was a part of that process, and unfortunately that process hasn't ended with the best possible outcome. In over 2 years of that process being ongoing, which started off as a 3-month process, we had 7 months without a meeting.
Right.
And I have never been part of any group, any initiative, any committee at any time in my life that never had a meeting for 7 months. And one of the outcomes of it is that third-party mixed data information is still an outlier. This is still a highly controversial and contentious issue that the trusts and the government here are not prepared to tackle. And for victims and survivors, adoptees, the requesters of this information remains outstanding in terms of what we need to get access to, what we have human rights access to, how we've been discriminated against and still being discriminated against at this point, where people like yourselves, people that may be non-adopted, have rightful access to, and we don't.
Okay, so Paula, I just want to say, look, we all appreciate how traumatic this is, and we're trying as best as we can, and there is consensus across the committee that this all needs to be dealt with in terms of a trauma-informed approach to everything. But Paula, can I suggest that as part of getting evidence, we can get the Human Rights and Equality Commission back just on this issue about access to records? Because I'm not content, first of all, that some, if not all, people have to pay to get their access to the records. And secondly, when it comes to this issue, what is the compellability for an inquiry if the religious orders and others put covenants on that information? So I'm respectfully asking that the Human Rights Commission in particular be on this be brought back. I can see that we've got CAJ, maybe they can, I don't know, but certainly it's something we need to ask for before we seek any of our own legal advice. Just want to say thank you. Thanks, Paula.
Thank you, Carol, and we'll certainly take that on as an action. Thank you. Okay, so Harry, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Ian, for coming in today. I know you've answered somewhat the question, but Queen's University in itself, they seem to have a lot of information. So would you say they have more? They're not very forthcoming with to you. Would you say they're very open with their information, or would you say they're cagey with it?
I'm ultra sceptical, Harry, to be honest with you. And since 2016, being involved in these issues and trying to extract information from different sources is problematic at best. I mean, we know about the legislation that was brought in to preserve historical records, etc., but at the end of the day, you're at the mercy or the lack of mercy of people that hold these records, because unless you know, people like myself will know the types of records that are available, what you can get access to, what we should get access to. But the religious orders, the charitable organisations, institutions like Queen's University and the state, by the way, I like to emphasise that in all of this here, the state is under scrutiny and under charge as well. The workhouses were run by local government, and there's a convenience, Harry, around the fact that it's not a coincidence that a lot of the workhouse records have been effectively disappeared, like a lot of the people as well. This is what we're finding, and the wholesale redaction that occurs around access to information is wholly unacceptable as well. That's particularly, in all of this here, and what the government has to realise as well is that when you dismiss, when you neglect, that's classified as emotional abuse. So when you don't act, when you don't hold people to account, when you don't find out who's responsible, you're effectively compounding the trauma and reinforcing that trauma, and that has long-term effects for people. The amount of people that I know, the contacts I've made, brilliant people in the last 8 years, the mothers affected, the adopted people affected, that have all died, that have taken their own lives. The people that would contact the likes of me in the wee hours, in the dark hours of the night, people that have a propensity to addiction, people that are wrestling with the dilemma of, should I look for my biological mother? Should I look for my sibling? Should I look for my child? And can't come to any kind of reconciliation with that, and go to their grave with that dilemma. The access to information is, as I say, with the trusts, even around court records, for example, there's no criteria for an adopted person to get access to their court records. When you apply to social services in the trusts to get a record of your adoption file, what the social workers normally do then is go along to the court, for example, and they will look at your record, your file, and then they decide, based on their experience, how they're trained, about what you should know. They interpret what you should know, and they put that on your summary. Now they get access to that. What the trust didn't tell me, what the trust still don't tell people, is that I took it upon myself to go, do you know what, I'm going to apply to the local court myself to see if I can get access to my adoption file that are held in the court records. And lo and behold, I was given permission to go and see my record in Armagh Courthouse, and I could take notes on it and walk away from it. But that was all at the discretion of a judge. There's no criteria for this. One person, a different judge, can ask for the same information and be denied. Somebody tell me if that's right or wrong. So access to information is being denied. I mean, the redactions that occur in summaries, and the government do this as well in terms of access to information as well. Because one thing that, Paula, you touched on a few minutes ago, I sent in an FOI to the Executive Office over 3 years ago, asking what the scoping exercises were that were apparently conducted in 2016 by the Executive Government. And I found out through a whole series of pages, many of which were completely blacked out, the emails between the officers of the Office of First Minister and Deputy First Minister, the emails that were redacted, the conversations that took place. And what I found out was that there was a Magdalene laundry scoping exercise carried out and reported on the 20th June 2013. That's 11 years ago, Paul. Then, I don't know what's happened in that. Maybe you guys, I don't want to send in any more FOIs. It took the Executive Office 2 years to fulfil that Freedom of Information request. That breaks all of the rules and regulations around the Information Commissioner's Office. I was sent from pillar to post, and that was sent from pillar to post to the Historical Institutional Abuse Department and round the house until they eventually got that to me. And a lot of that material is completely redacted, blanked out. So, like what you said, Paula, the length of time this is going on, the length of time the government knows about, Hansard has reported these. There's been debates in the Northern Ireland Assembly about what happened in Tuam, for example, in the revelations in 2013. Dr. Sean Lucy of Queen's University carried out a scoping exercise in 2014. It took more scoping exercise in 2016. And Dr. Sean Lucy at that point provided 5 options, the same options we were provided for by the reference group in 2020 under Judith Gillespie.
I'm conscious we need to keep it in the confines of Executive Office.
Right.
Go ahead. I know you have a lot to say. Go ahead, Harry. What's going to follow up?
Thank you very
Does that
much.
help, Harry?
Yes,
Does that
no,
answer?
it's very good, very good. You mentioned GlaxoSmithKline.
Yep.
Do you think they possibly have information that they're not willing to share, or do you think they don't have information? What's your gut feeling on them?
My gut feeling, yeah. Being the eternal skeptic, probably part of my adoption as a child, and the mistrust of my life experience ever since, in my trying to chase down government and a lot of everything that's happened in the meantime. GlaxoSmithKline, a lot of what came out of GlaxoSmithKline was disclosed in the south of Ireland in terms of what they did in a lot of the institutions in the likes of Bessborough and Tuam, Rosscrea, and of course I've asked the question up here. I don't know how their records show an unnamed institution. How's that possible? For a highly professional organisation like that there, you think would be across all of the detail, and there's an unnamed institution for the 44 children that were subjected to a drug and vaccine trial here in Northern Ireland in 1962. So I don't believe them. Not for 1 minute. And unfortunately, the Irish government has given them complete and utter impunity when it comes to how they're effectively then treated in terms of the redress. They haven't been asked to make any contributions to the redress scheme in the south of Ireland. I don't want that to happen up here either. And I think it's absolutely abhorrent that we allow these organisations to basically carry out all of this stuff without any kind of accountability. And I asked Queen's University, because in my submission to ESK about my own circumstances, they came back and sent me details of trials that were carried out here in Northern Ireland between 1963 and 1969. And I asked for details because all over it were these Queen's University researchers that had apparently carried out these trials. Queen's said that, well, it wasn't with our permission. So their credibility comes from Queen's University, but in terms of standing over it, who monitored it, who supervised it, what were the after effects, Queen's University are washing their hands of it.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Okay, Sinead, please.
Okay, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Ewan. I thank you for all the work that you're doing in this and the advocacy that you've been given over the years.
Thanks,
and it's tough for us to listen to, but you know, it's tough work for you, and I'm sure it's had an impact on your family as well. So I just want to say that, but it's unbelievable work that you're shining a light where there was no light before you engaged in that work. So thank you.
Thank you.
So, what actions do you believe Queen's University need to do in order for us to be satisfied that they've given full disclosure? And I'm not just talking about factual release of information, but is there any amends that they can make for the work that they have carried out and remains that have been literally taken from workhouses and laundries and without really permission maybe by, you know, religious institutions or that, but not by maybe perhaps parents or families or anything. You know, they are saying that they followed the law of the time, but the law of today doesn't bear, you know, what the procedures that they followed are inhumane now when you look back on it. So it's today, what amends can they make today based on what they did in the past? What do you think would be appropriate?
You're absolutely right. And that, the disclosure, the information recovery, all of that there's absolutely imperative. For them to turn around and tell me that, and tell you, that basically to try and plug the gap in the 1,800 odd people, that they can't give any kind of a location for in terms of how they were used and what their final resting place would be, for me is unacceptable. At the end of the day, some of the sample information that I give you shows that very, very few are compared to the other institutions in terms of private remains that came from residential addresses, for example, are minimal compared to where they came from in other institutions. So that's the psychiatric mainly and the workhouses mainly. Those remains were off the scale. And in the briefing you had said about what was effectively an opt-out scheme at the time, but given, for example, the way you look at the workhouse regime and how it worked, how families were separated and segregated when they went into a workhouse. If somebody died, and when disease was rife in them days as well, things like tuberculosis and all these, it's unimaginable to think that somebody actually went to the family of a child or a man and his wife or a husband and said, look, your relatives just died, we need information, or we need your consent, shall I say, and your informed consent on top of that, as whether or not we can now use this person for anatomical research and teaching. I mean, it's not beyond the imagination to think that this just didn't happen. And the Commission's report talked about how legislation was in place, how the theory was there, but in the practice, these things just didn't work out the way they did. So for me, Queen's have to do their very best to try and establish, to try and tell me and to try and tell us that they don't have a paper trail in terms of the private burials, so the return of all of these people to their loved ones on a private basis, and how they were all used. For me, they would have some kind of exit documentation to say, right, well, this person was used in this circumstance, and this person then went on to be cremated or buried, and this person here was then sent back to their family. For me, that makes all sorts of logistical sense, professional sense, anything you can think of, and they haven't done that. So for me, it looks like some of the things that I'm suspicious about in terms of what the Commission's report in the South of Ireland said, in terms of how many people were effectively then on their body parts crammed into one particular coffin to mitigate against the cost of graves and to mitigate against the cost of coffins, the timber for those coffins. Has Queen's done the same? And they have to come up. Is the burden of proof on Queen's University, or is the burden of proof on people like me and yourselves to ask them, listen, there are massive anomalies here. What have you got to say about this? You know, because when you think of what the proportion and the ratio is of the data of 1,980 people, and 1,824 of those people are effectively disappeared. So Queens need to do better. And unfortunately, Sinead, this is a widespread issue in terms of what we're investigating. This is the same with the religious orders, the charitable organisations, in terms of the anomalies between death records, between burial records, between the exit pathways and the admission pathways. It's just off the scale.
I ask you, do you believe that records exist but haven't been turned over, or do you believe that they have been actually destroyed?
Well, there's been a lot of arsonists that used to run around this country for 100 years, and none of them ever done time. They seem to conveniently turn up at Queen's University and social workers' offices. I mean, we've seen in the last number of years campaigning, victims and survivors, for example, can't get access to their information. They're being told by social workers, oh, we've no file on this, we've no file on that. Then suddenly you do a bit of media, and the next day a victim survivor gets the call to say, we've actually found your file. And this is widespread now, so it is, It's happened far too often. I'm of the opinion that when you think about places like Belgium and South Africa, where the police were given judicial powers to go in and search and seize all sorts of records and files from people, I think that's where we're at, because this carrot and stick stuff, this trying to be appeasing and ameliorating to the religious orders, etc., it doesn't work. As I said earlier, you are bound by what they want to give you. And unless people like me, public records, the academic researchers know the type of files, records and documents that are available, then it's up to the religious and Queen's University, etc., to hand it over. I mean, the convenience in around there's a fire in 1963, we've lost them files because we moved department, we moved into a new building. How convenient is all of this stuff like?
Okay, Ian, thank you very much.
Okay, Padraig, please.
Yeah, Ewan, firstly, thank you for your presentation. It's a really difficult area to discuss. Really appreciate the detail that you've given to us on that. I think the thing that you says around intergenerational trauma is key here, and it's about being denied access to information that you need and that you're entitled to. And for me, that's the fundamental thing here is around that. And I think that, I mean, you've spoken about genetics, you've spoken about all those issues, and this is just, it's unspeakable that people cannot get these answers and the information that they need. I think, it must be extremely difficult to talk about this, and they have done a lot of this work. The one question, I suppose a lot of the stuff that I did have questions on has been covered, but one of the things that and I may have picked you up wrong here, but just around the memorialisation, you'd spoken about Queens and that. I'm curious to know about the process of that and how that's being conducted. So, I mean, do you have any idea who, or maybe Chair, this is something that we can find out around who's been consulted on that? I just would like a bit more information on that, because I just think that we are talking about intergenerational trauma. We're talking about people being denied a right to access to information. And I'm just curious as to how that process is actually going on.
Well, first of all, I was going to come in at the end and ask you about good practice in other universities, because I don't think that they're that far down the road at Queen's in this space, and that's why we're very keen to get in front of committees so that it is victim centred and that they have a voice, etc. So my understanding is they haven't gone that far down the road, but we need to make sure that whatever the process is, it's in line with good practice. But do you want to comment, Ian?
Yeah, that's right, Paula. Yeah, thanks, Padraig. The memorialisation obviously is a massive part of this, you know, as it will be for all of the institutional issues, whether it's affecting the HIA or whatever it is. And obviously, I've asked them about that, what that process is going to look like. So they've talked to me about, I suppose, consulting with different stakeholders then, and including their own department, their own university, and even the medical students in the university. And I mean, they're even at a stage where they're thinking down to closing the anatomy department because everything now is going digital, you know, around 3D practice and all this sort of stuff. So that obviously has no bearing on what we do going forward. But yeah, that memorialisation, I have asked them, okay, which is why I'd said to them, listen, I shouldn't be in this position where I'm having to constantly chase you guys. You know, as a victim survivor, unfortunately we find ourselves in these circumstances far too often where we have to keep pushing people. And Queen's University is no different. So I have said, listen, I think we're about time now where you guys presented yourselves to the Truth Recovery Consultation Forum and you talked about this, and that's part of the awareness around this. Unfortunately, as distasteful as it is, it has to be done. And we can't shirk our responsibilities just because this is something that a lot of people don't talk about and think that it is actually too distressing to talk about for a lot of people, and I found that in the consultation forum as well. So that memorialisation process is absolutely key here. How they're going to do that, what the text is going to look like, whether it's on plaques or it's going to be an eternal flame or what it's going to look like. But my sense from them so far, anytime I've asked a question, they've been a bit sort of political in their answers and not the sort of skirt round it and circumnavigate and don't really give you a straight answer, as can happen sometimes. So what they've said to me is, what I'm getting from them is that I don't think they're going to make a direct reference on any of these memorials to the people that were used from institutional sources. And I don't think that's acceptable either. I think there needs to be a particular reference to sort of separate them from people on the body donation bequest scheme and how they acquired all of those bodies and how people were used in that institutional setting, to be honest with you, Patrick.
No, I mean, you've raised really key points there. I mean, I am a bit concerned around, obviously, Queen's role in this and then them as a lead partner in the memorialisation as well. I mean, to me that's quite concerning. I'm just wondering what your opinion on that would be.
It's concerning for me too, to be honest with you, because, you know, as part of the truth recovery process on how that is out working, we have asked to be part of a co-design process, which includes co-decision making, and that's something that's not always present. So it can look like optics and at times, but in terms of how that works out, that's not always the case. I mean, I looked at minutes of a meeting of a consultation forum there recently, and it talked about the legislation being drawn up for the redress and for the public inquiry, and it was told to people in the forum that this is not really a co-decision aspect here because it's complicated. Now, victims and survivors find that absolutely offensive and insulting to say that this is not co-decision because it doesn't suit us and because it's complicated. So the capabilities around the victims and survivors are not really up to a co-decision process.
I mean, I think from a committee point of view, it's really useful that the Queens are going to come and hopefully in the future and have that discussion, because to me that this is critical, and the voice of victims and survivors at the centre of this is critical as well. So I think we've a lot more work to do in the time ahead around that. So thanks very much.
Brian, please.
Okay, well, thank you, Ewan, for attending today and for the work that you've been doing on this. And you're shining a light into a matter which a lot of people don't want a light shone into. A lot of this relates to different times and when there were approaches that were inappropriate and disrespectful to the dead, but also disrespectful to life and to people. I'm aware of the research that you've done and the papers that you've sent to us. How much more do you? My question is, first of all, how much more do you think can be found out? From what you've been telling us, I'm wondering, will any records exist for? It talks in the papers here about a time when it was common practice, and I mean, this is part of the inappropriate actions by the state, but also by the Roman Catholic Church and by educational institutions, disrespect for people who had died. But it was common practice, we're told, throughout the UK and Ireland until the mid-1960s that unclaimed deceased residents from institutions such as workhouse and psychiatric hospitals could be used for anatomical study. So I'm wondering, do you have any realistic expectation of how much could be found out? And secondly, in terms of the Truth and Recovery independent panel that we heard from regarding mother and baby institutions, is this forming part of their work, or is this a separate body of work?
We could be forgiven for thinking in the second part of your question there that it wasn't part of it, particularly because, as Sinead had flagged, it wasn't included in the interim report. And I can assure you the independent panel are absolutely aware of the anatomical issues, because I first brought them up in the consultation forum and as part of the truth recovery process when I was going through all of the freedom of information requests. So Phil Scraton, etc., all knew about it. And that concerns me as well, the fact that this wasn't brought up as part of the interim report. The answer you received on the day was this is a question of timing and it's an ongoing investigation. It's just, I've still been trying to get my head around, because all the issues we're talking about are ongoing investigations. None of these have came to any kind of a conclusion. And in and around the timing, I don't know what that means. But I can tell you what it means in terms of the fact that this is still an ongoing process. Whether or not I continue very much further with Queen's University, I doubt that I'll have very much more engagement with them, because I would like to hand this over to not only yourselves but the Truth Consultation Forum. Because I think, as far as I'm concerned, I've done my bit in terms of trying to raise awareness about this, but I would like that pressure applied to them to say, okay, we need some kind of a public and awareness campaign here. If you want to stipulate the fact that, well, we weren't around at the time, and as you've talked about a sort of historical lens to all of these things, we don't accept that, because for us, there's no such thing as historical abuse when the abuse is ongoing. That has never came to an end. And I could tell you about recent unsavoury events. For example, Cork University Hospital 2 years ago, a man and a woman had the unfortunate case where their baby died, and they didn't know, they weren't asked for consent, any kind of consent, whether it was informed or otherwise, for their baby to have a post-mortem, have its brain removed, and not be buried with the baby's body, instead be sent to Antwerp in Belgium and disposed of along with other clinical waste. That was 2 years ago. So whenever I talk about these issues, I ask people, and you'll see the articles that I put in reference to Queen's University on their form, in terms of what they've done recently in terms of the retention of organs, etc., and those microscopic tissue samples that turned up at a public auction, and Queen's went, no idea how that happened. There's a lot of convenience here that doesn't point itself towards accountability and discovery and responsibility around this, Brian. The access to information is again an ongoing burning issue. Despite what we did with the Access to Adoption Working Group, that has no statutory basis to it. And there was adoption legislation, in terms of reformed legislation of the 1987 Act, began in 2004, and it's been a prolonged sort of process in terms of, yes, legislation was drawn up for a new adoption and children's order. That's still stagnant. And my latest information was that we could be still working on this adoption and children's order and the potential around access to information, getting that on a statutory basis up to 2027. That's not good enough.
Right. So how does that tie in with this work, or is that a separate matter?
Well, it's all about access to information.
Right.
It's how we're being still discriminated against, how people are stonewalled in terms of trying to get to the truth. And I always remind people that even when you get documented information from an official capacity, there will always be concerns around the authenticity of that information due to the large-scale falsification of certificates, including birth certificates and death certificates, all of this sort of information. So we have to take a lot of our information with a pinch of salt. You know, when legislation at a given time, for example, might have said, oh, this child wasn't taken for adoption until we had asked its mother for consent after the 6 weeks as per legislation. But in actual fact, in practice, that baby was with its adoptive parents within a matter of days or within a matter of weeks. Mm-hmm. And the only way to push back against that is by the living testimony of all of the people involved there to say that's not actually what happened.
So just to Chair, just briefly to clarify, regarding this in the specific issue of body parts remains being used for anatomical research,
yeah.
Is there any process underway currently, apart from, if you like, private research that's been done? Is it part of any statutory process?
No, it's not so far. The academics haven't looked into it, and I find that strange. Drug and vaccine trials, again, they haven't looked into it either. And you know, in all of this, it's important to remember that is a process, and the process is as important as the outcome for us. And what Queen's now decide to do, I feel as if the executive committee needs to now push them on this here to try and get this expedited a lot quicker, because so far they haven't come up with a lot of answers, and we need those answers. As I say, going back to what Paula said earlier in terms of let's wait for the statutory inquiry. Well, Queen said to us, look, there's been no malpractice here, and again in the briefing I have shown you how they have said that they have complied with the anatomy legislation, and they haven't, because they've told us that the records only start in 1927, for example, and they've said their consent records go back to 1922. So there's a lot of anomalies here that Queen's apparently can't stand over, and we need answers.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Claire, please.
Thank you, Chair. Ewan, apologies for missing your opening remarks. But I suppose just listening to the conversation and, you know, even to pick up on that last point around policy, that's the minimum we should expect, you know, from all of this is a process.
Yep.
And, you know, the fact that that's not happening is really disappointing. And, you know, even just listening to your experience of 2 years ago, it feels like they haven't learned anything. And, you know, I'm horrified by that. I really am horrified by that experience. And you know, wow. I suppose the two kind of things that come to mind, and other members have talked of it, is the trauma-informed approach, which, you know, it nearly feels like a new phrase that we're using, and I know it's of interest to this committee as well, but given the nature of this work, you know, we should have been doing that anyway because of the victims and the survivors that are involved. So it's disappointing, to hear that hasn't happened because of how they've conducted themselves. And another one, and maybe it's not the right phrase, but duty of candour in terms of giving that information and recognising it, because, you know, I would expect in much of this it's about acknowledgement, and when you acknowledge something has happened, it's wrong, you know, you said it yourself, it's not a nice issue, but we acknowledged it happened, you know, people need to be sorry for it having happened, but now the next step in that is providing the information to give people answers to at least follow through on that. And it just feels like all of this hasn't, you know, really been taken in by those who are responsible, and I don't know if it's because time is passing and you know, it feels like there's not as much pressure on them, and you know, so I suppose really it's more comments, I suppose, but you know, what pressure can we put on people to kind of bring it back to why this was wrong and what we need to do to kind of some way address that?
Yeah, that's very important, Claire. Thank you. I mean, unfortunately, we're in a position where a lot of this is about self-preservation, and it's about reputation more than anything else. So the concerns and the grievances, the complaints, the rightful harms and violations that have been carried out here, or if you want to call them potential violations, that's absolutely okay as well. So basically what I've done then is to try and say to these guys, look, I have a lot of concerns about a lot of things here, and as far as I'm concerned, they're all justified on every level, and we need you guys to step up, and if you don't want to accept responsibility for what happened in the past and your staff members, etc., yeah, that's absolutely okay, but we still deserve some kind of truth and justice, accountability, discovery and closure and redress about this. This is part of redress. This is essentially what we need, and when I say to people, I don't try to scare anybody by any means, but if I were to say to people in this room or people on a wider scale in the general public, what if I was to tell you that you may not be interested in this now, but if you were to find out you were affected by these institutional issues in 6 weeks or 6 months or 6 years, how much difference would it make? Yeah. By then it might be too late. And that's important that people take that sort of perspective on this, because in 1950, 1% of the entire population of Ireland was incarcerated. That was second only to Russia at the time. We now reckon that 1 in 3, maybe 4 people in the entire population of Ireland are affected by these issues. So if you think you're not affected by it today, you might be affected by it tomorrow.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I don't have no other indications. So thank you, Ewan. We look forward to Queen's coming. We'll go back over your testimony, both written and verbal today then, and we'll make sure that we put those questions to Queen's when they come before us. But no doubt we'll be back in contact with you, because obviously the public inquiry terms of reference and background will be out soon, so we'll be keen to hear your opinion on that and how we could possibly change the legislation. Okay.
Thanks very much.
Thank
Thanks
you so
for all
much.
your time.
Thank you. Okay, members, so just move on to our second session then. So this is around the disposal of bodies, and we're going to hear from a number of representatives, but would like to refer you to page 62 of the pack for your clerk's brief, page 64 for the RISE paper, and then there's statements, etc. in your pack there, the information's there. Hello, so just to remind members that that you received evidence from Tony Maguire. She sent emails last Friday and on Tuesday afternoon. Okay, welcome ladies. So Tony Maguire, consultant archaeologist, and Chauvenine.
Susan.
What's
No,
her?
Susan.
Oh, it is Susan. Oh, right, okay. I thought we were being very fancy.
No.
So you're very welcome, ladies.
Thank you.
So are you happy to go ahead and brief the committee?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Do you want me to start?
Yeah, I'm just going to take notes while Tony's...
Perfect. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you very much for having us this afternoon. As you know, I'm an anthropologist and archaeologist, and my research at Queen's into the location of landscapes within the landscape of Killiney in 2004 was the start of my passion to investigate infant burials within marginalised furtive sites. My involvement in Milltown Cemetery started in 2008 when I was contacted by Brian Gibson, the legal representative for the diocese. I was subsequently asked at that meeting in Lisbrain if I would take on the research to identify the location and extent of burials in land sold by the diocese to the Ulster Wildlife Trust in 2000. I was told at that meeting that the church had no money, and I said, no problem, I'm willing to take on the research, but I had a number of stipulations in lieu. The first stipulation, the most important one, was that I would stay with the project until it was completed to my satisfaction, not the church's. The second one was that any land that was brought back into the stewardship of the cemetery was to be cared for and basically never disturbed or used for burial again. Monsignor Callum McCahan, who was present at the meeting, agreed and accepted my terms on behalf of the diocese. The subsequent research into the land at Milltown Cemetery in the Bog Meadows over 4 years that I worked there is well documented. And as a result, 6.28 acres containing approximately 11,000 souls was brought back into the cemetery in 2011, with promises from Bishop Noel Traynor that the land would never again be used for burial.
However, my experiences in dealing with the Catholic Church and religious groups over the past 16 years has proved that their promises don't always hold water. Miltown has just issued news that they are releasing new areas for burial as new graves in the proximity of the current burial graves, the babies' graves. The issue surrounding Tomb Mother and Baby Home hit the headlines about 2013-14. When I visited Tomb, I could see with the site that it did not hold individual burials, baby burials, as Catherine Corliss had thought, but there was evidence of tunnels within a small section of land. I spent the next couple of years between the north and the south supporting various groups investigating other mother and baby homes for marginalised burial, including Sean Ross Abbey in Rosscray and Bessborough in Cork. To my knowledge, the only mother and baby home to be investigated for burial so far in the north has been Marionvale in Newry. For this site, when I started the research, I got the usual sort of statement, there are no burials, there are no records, whatever. However, that was not entirely true. Among the registered in the documents at the parish house in Carrickcruppen was a baptism register for Marionvale, which made very interesting reading. The data it contained showed that along with women from elsewhere in Northern Ireland, pregnant women were being moved from mother and baby homes in the south of Ireland up to Marionvale in the north. They would appear to stay there for a short period of time until their baby was born. Then they disappeared from the records, from the registers, and were either sent back to the mother and baby home they had come from in the south, or just released. This register also recorded information on the babies from Marionvale. Some were to be adopted, and while some entries did have adoption order references, others did not. In some cases, it actually recorded information on the adoptive parents, their name, locations, and the changes they made to the birth names of the babies they were adopting. Some simply noted that they were to be registered in Killarney. Now, there was quite a few entries of that, and I tried to find out what the reason was, but it turns out there's a large children's home in Killarney. So what I deduced was a lot of babies were moving back down there to be adopted. One entry noted that a child was to be registered in the Diocese of Cincinnati. It took me a while to consider why women were being moved, were brought to Northern Ireland to give birth, because that's basically what it seemed like. And then I realised that a baby born in the north of Ireland was a British citizen and entitled to a passport, something that babies born in the south were not necessarily entitled to all their documentation. This could make it easier if babies were being adopted abroad. There was another option as to why this issue of moving women around might be beneficial for the institutions concerned. Women incarcerated in homes, and I do stress incarcerated, they would naturally form friendships with other women within the mother and baby homes. This could be difficult if they wanted to keep their babies in defiance of the pressure to have them adopted. The movement of women to another institution could undermine them further and perhaps make it easier to push the option of adoption on them. There was one other issue that came to me, and that was the issue of plausible deniability by the institutions. If someone came back to an institution looking for their birth mother or information on their adoption, the order could state categorically, there's no record of your birth at this institution, because in fact there wouldn't be. It would be in a completely different legal jurisdiction. Surrounding the issues of the fragility of records, I have dealt now since 2008 with Miltown Cemetery, and getting access, because I came into that particular research on behalf of the diocese, I had access to records for roughly about 6 weeks. When the diocese suddenly realised just how big the issue of marginalised burial in mass graves in Miltown Cemetery was, the records were withdrawn. And I had to then resort to finding records and information elsewhere. Prony was my main source. But there are still major issues with this sort of idea of marginalised infant burial. In Miltown, for instance, there is a grave that is recorded in the registers, LM59. LM59 was opened in 1957 and contains 9 individuals, 3 women and 6 babies. According to the gridded system in Milltown Cemetery as it stands today, LM59 does not exist. Where is LM59? Where are all the other graves that grave diggers have said to us there were loads of graves at the section where LM is? There are far too many questions and far too few answers. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, very powerful. Thank you very much. First question would be, have you approached the Department for Communities around whether they are going to legislate for regulations of cemeteries that are not in state ownership? Have you?
Yeah. Part of the issue for institutions and religious institutions to basically legally get away with what they're doing is private cemetery status. That applies to any burial ground attached to a religious group or order or any institution that is governed by a religious group or order. It basically has virtually no legislation governing how you bury someone, how long you bury them for, and what you do with their remains once they're removed. In Milltown Cemetery, we had an issue in the 1970s where a large swath of public ground, poor ground, was reclaimed by the cemetery. And we have affidavits which I've supplied to you from people who were in the cemetery at the time, saying that those remains were removed, coffins were broken up, bones were either thrown in the skip, or some of the larger bones were dumped down the bog meadows where the babies are. Very recently, on what date in February?
1st of February.
1st of February, I was in Milltown Cemetery because I've been very concerned lately because they've been digging up the area where the babies are buried. And actually they came across a human femur. They uncovered a human femur, disarticulated on its own. Police were called. And the cemetery's response to why the human femur was discovered basically in shallow soil was that, well, you know, we reclaimed graves in the 70s and those are just bones from there that were dragged down the bottom. Further verifying statements that come forward from grave diggers and managers of the cemetery since the 1970s up to date, that these things have happened over and over again.
Okay, thank you. So you know that the Executive Office has said they're going to do the public inquiry, and I'm just wondering in what way would you like to see further investigation into the area, your area of work?
Well, the person who spoke before me, Ewan, made some very, very good points. Mm-hmm. Part of the issue here is this protection of records. Okay. As we found out with Marianvale, and I mean, I've yet to investigate a site that I haven't had. There's been a fire, there's been a flood, there's been some other act of God to account for the fact that there are no available records. That is not the case. There are records, and they are available, and they are held by the religious orders, etc., concerned. Part of the issue with the private cemetery status is we need access to those records. People cannot look and basically join the dots without this. For someone to understand what was happening at Marianvale fully, they also need to be able to trace the mothers and the babies who were brought from the south of Ireland into the north and then separated and going different ways. To get the full picture, records have to be taken into a setting where they are preserved, they are looked at properly, and they are accessible for people who are looking to find out what happened.
Okay, thank you. Connie, Deputy Chair.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tony and Susan. I know we've met before. You've shown me the pictures, and I've been down to Milltown myself, and the scale of this is what I found most horrifying. Mm-hmm. Some will find it very hard to believe this happened, but the more evidence I hear about these issues that are all linked, these are things unions talked about, also things that we've heard from other people giving testament to this committee, the culture that existed in this society around vulnerable people, women, people in poverty, was absolutely horrendous. And I think I just want to give you an opportunity, really, if you could maybe just elaborate on the scale of this and the unmarked graves in Milltown, the number of babies that are in these graves. And I know our remit really is mother and baby homes, but just talk maybe a wee bit more about any other people and other family members who are in these graves as well, because I think the scale of this is something I really want to be put on record today.
There are two main areas of public ground, as I refer to, within Milltown Cemetery. There are three main fields right in the middle of the cemetery. Originally, they would have been outside the boundary. This land is not consecrated land. You've also got the large area at the bottom where the babies are in more recent years, from roughly 1937 up to, although the records go up to 86, gravediggers said they just stopped recording at that point, but they continued burying until the 90s. In the top section, there is thought to be 80,000 souls buried in that land. In the bottom section, we have 11,000. That is not the true number for either area, because these graves were left open for a period of time. It wasn't as if they opened a grave, they conducted burials, and they closed a grave. We have one grave in the bottom section at Milltown Cemetery, OG 138, contains 429 infants. 429. That grave was opened in 1974, and they were still burying it in 1986. So that grave was left open. And part of the issue through this long history is when a baby would die at home, because of the teaching of the church, these children, because they were still born or they died soon after birth, they weren't christened. They therefore were outside the remit of care of the church, and they were not allowed to be buried on consecrated ground. People had to find a way around it. And there were two ways. Either they sneaked in and quietly put the baby into an already open grave, for which then that burial has no records whatsoever, or quite often they would choose to avoid the stigma attached to being buried in poor ground, and they would bring a child to an area known as a Colleen, which is really like a folk religion site, and it would be in the landscape. It would be close to something memorable that people would know to go back to, something they could identify the spot. That baby would be simply buried in a small shallow grave, and custom dictated that it had to be buried between sundown on the day it died and sunrise on the next day. Now that just further emphasised the whole furtive nature of these burials and the fear around some of the burials. And they're actually categorised as the dangerous dead. And there were all sorts of categories of these people buried together in mass graves. They were the poorest of the poor, 9 times out of 10. They didn't have much in life, and they had less in death. And when I asked about what had happened to the records for the burials that had been reclaimed in the 70s, I was advised, well, they're just Tipp-Exed out. I couldn't believe it. So they were saying, we've just Tipp-Exed them out. I was dumbfounded. I'm still, every time I think of that, I'm just dumbfounded. But there are large numbers, and every grave in these sections of land are mass graves. It's quite regular to see 30 and 40 buried in every single grave.
Thank you. It is shocking that 400 babies in a grave that's unmarked with no records of them for people's families.
The records are simply in the register. These are 429 babies that we do have register for. And because this would be a later section, even stillborns at this point would have had, in 1962, they brought in a stillbirth register in the north of Ireland. That didn't come in till I think the 90s in the south of Ireland. Prior to 1962, any stillborn baby, the only chance of a record of their existence at all was if they were registered in the records of the cemetery. But there would be no birth certificate, therefore no corresponding death certificate. They just disappear into the ether.
I could just have one more quick one. It is obviously so concerning. I think when it comes to mother and baby homes, but also other areas, I think it's really, really important that we preserve these records and preserve these graves for the family, but also for truth, to find out what's happened. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more now about what's actually happening now in Milltown, which is, from what I have seen, and evidence would suggest that these mass graves are now being dug up and sold as new graves, and the impact that has on families, but also the impact that could have on the families who are now burying them, thinking they've got a plot in a grave where the rest of their family is, and to be found that it's actually on the side of a mass grave.
I was actually alerted to this because I thought this was done and dusted. I thought this land was safe, it was protected, and the church was going to honour the promises they had made. But late last year, I happened to speak to someone who happened to mention just casually that their parents had bought a grave in Milltown Cemetery. And I thought, but there are no graves. There is no new ground in Milltown Cemetery for sale. The cemetery actually was closed in 1980 because there was no new graves. Well, what happens is the cemetery seems to close, and maybe a decade or so later it will open again, and there'll be an announcement, we found new land. There is no new land in Milltown Cemetery. When I went down to find out what had happened, we discovered they have 14-ton diggers supposedly digging drainage trenches in a very patterned manner across the whole section of land where the baby graves are. Now, some of these burials are 12 inches below the soil. 12 inches. You go into that land, and this is layer upon layer upon layer. You go into that land with something like a 14-ton digger with a toothed shovel on the front of it, tearing up trenches, and you are going to destroy the evidence that's there. We also know that there were lorries coming in the early hours of the morning to remove huge soil heaps from the land. So anything that was disturbed and broken up, it's gone. There's also a section on the right-hand side at the bottom of the cemetery known as Section D. There are no records for Section D in the cemetery office, although we do have affidavits from not only grave diggers, but past managers from Milltown Cemetery who said, we laid out those graves. We buried babies and individuals in those graves, and they have signed affidavits to that effect. Yet, according to the cemetery, we have no records. That's why they're selling the land, because they are saying, again, it's a plausible deniability issue. We have no records to show there's burials here. Having spoken to grave diggers who are currently working in the cemetery, they have said the occurrence of digging up remains is quite a regular thing. The other thing was, when I came in earlier this year, the church, the diocese had said to us that they had an archaeologist doing a watching brief, which means normally if someone was on land they suspect may have burials, as the digger takes off the surface, literally inches at a time, an archaeologist is walking in front behind the shovel to make sure nothing's disturbed. We attended 14 days in a row, and out of those 14 days, only 2 days was an archaeologist even present on the site. When the femur was uncovered, there was no archaeologist. It took a phone call from someone in the digger, and 15-20 minutes later, someone arrived.
Thank you. And Patrick.
Yeah, I have a lot of questions, to be honest, but I just want to touch on 2 issues really at the minute. First one, you've mentioned already about cross-border working, and the fact you've been working all across Ireland on this. So, I mean, Paul, you've mentioned the AFC as well, and to me, I think for something as critical as finding answers here, we can't work in silos. So I'm kind of keen to hear from you what's already in place to ensure that there is that cross-border cooperation and learning as well. But going forward, what do you see as needed to actually learn from what has happened in the past, what's gone wrong in the past and in similar circumstances, and how do we ensure that it's done better?
I have had a meeting with some members of the committee looking into the mother and baby homes issue in the north. I was actually due to speak to the Commission in the south in March 2020, and then COVID hit, and that just didn't happen. The Commission here, I've spoken to them, I've given them a lot of information, I've given them a lot of pointers. Some areas where I suspect records are outside of the control of the church, such as Marionvale. The babies born to Marionvale were not born in the home because it was a much later home at opening. It didn't open until the 50s. The babies were born at Daisy Hill Hospital. So Daisy Hill Hospital will have records, and we find out through some information that they are known as the 132 files because that was the address of the home. It was 132 Armagh Road. Now they will have information on any infants who died, and very likely the hospital actually buried the babies. But we still haven't found the babies who are recorded as having died at Marionvale. And that still leaves that as an open case. That needs to happen. Where babies were being transported to the south of Ireland, there has to be a paper trail. There has to be. There's also money trails to look at. If you think at every mother that went into a mother and baby home, there were a number of trails of finance. First of all, there was the family. The church would ask for some donation towards their upkeep of their sinful daughter. Secondly, there was the unpaid labour that woman went through for God knows how many years. There was also evidence from some of the babies who were adopted to America that adopting families were asked for a donation to keep the baby and the mother, which was very expensive. And some were actually asked to sign a covenant that they would send a yearly donation as long as they lived back to the order concerned. That is 4 individual bits there, 4 streams of information for money alone. There has to be some way to go back through, even through government, to check what stipends were being paid to the mother and baby homes in support of mothers. What stipends were being asked for in support of a baby that died, to provide a coffin, maybe a grave, maybe burial. You have to think outside the box when you're dealing with these institutions, because I guarantee you the churches and the orders involved did. I don't think I quite finished answering your question, sorry. As far as cross-border communication and help, there's not a lot in place right now. I know that there has been some cross-border communications between the various commissions, but that needs to be put in place. I have real hope for our commission in the north, because historically we did not have the hand-in-glove relationship that the church and the state had in the south. So long as the commission here has sufficient teeth, records exist, and they need to be able to go after them and get them.
I suppose that brings me on to my next question as well. You know, one of the things you've said is about Marion, it's the one investigated so far.
It is.
So, what are the next steps? What happens next?
Maybe when I look at a site, when I started investigating these particular sites, I originally started looking at Killiney in the landscape, which are small individual areas of ground where babies were buried who would not be accepted by traditional religion. Sites and Monument at that time had 11 sites for County Antrim. I found 97. 97. That has updated their records. But through all the research, and the same sort of criteria kind of exists for those Killiney as exists for burial within institutional sites and poor grounds. There are certain patterns that emerge when you interrogate the data. And those patterns are very useful when you come to looking at any institution where marginalised burial occurred. There are certain spots in the landscape you will definitely want to investigate. You will need to have collaboration between, if possible, geophys, an amazing tool for research, but none of these are 100%. You cannot argue with the archaeology in the ground. At the end of the day, all these different things, the maps, the aerial photographs, the ethnography, the geophys, it's pointing you and closing in on the areas of interest that you then need to come in and excavate. And that has to happen. That has to happen without any excuses. And it will happen, I'm sure of it.
It's shocking to hear the number of sites even in County Antrim, and I'm sure the picture's very similar right across the north as well. So there's definitely a lot more to be done on that. But I think critical to this is that this can't wait.
No.
People need answers.
Absolutely.
And now?
I've been doing this work now, as I say, for 16 years, and I still get stonewalled at every institution I go to. And that's okay, because it kind of goes with the job. But I'm also one of those beasts that just won't give up. Mm-hmm. And I will find the information. And the information is there to be found. And quite often, the churches and the orders they'll drop something, they'll say something that indicates you do have records. So, at the end of the day, don't try to film me.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sinead, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Tony, for your evidence today. And it's your evidence and Ewan's evidence have synergy, and so thank you for being dogged and keeping on going. So we've talked a lot about Milltown here, and that but this is happening everywhere. And I have a story to tell, as I'm sure many other families have. My parents are buried in Ardmore Cemetery, and they're buried with a sister who died at 6 months. But I also have a brother buried in that cemetery, and I have no idea, no idea where he is. He was born but died shortly after birth, and because he wasn't baptised, he was not Christian, he wasn't worthy.
He was considered pagan.
Yeah. And so he wasn't worthy of being buried in a site, so he was put in the ground, but it's in that cemetery somewhere. Done a bit of investigation, and I think I know the area that he is born in or buried in, but there's no physical memoriam there at all. But it's very funny because it's just adjacent. Just literally, it's here, and adjacent to it is the burial site of the Sisters of the Good Shepherds, and they have massive statues and high on plinths, and it's majestic going into the site, because that's where the Sisters of the Good Shepherds convent, the Magdalen Laundry and the Waterside, and yet. My brother died. It was a home birth and complications and that. But children from that place are buried literally adjacent to there, and they have no memoriam or anything at all.
They were unworthy, according to the church, of memorialising. They were unworthy. And there are definite patterns when you're looking at a site. If you have an east-west aligned church, for instance, the land just to the north of it is overshadowed by the church. Therefore, that section of land tends to be darker and a bit damper and not so nice. That land is reserved for women and young children. Outside that boundary, your northern boundary, is where babies quite often would have been buried, or individuals who were committed suicide, or all sorts of different. There were different categories of this category of the dangerous dead, and they definitely couldn't be buried with the great and the good. It was not going to be tolerated. They were marginalised. You're separated. Here's the people we accept. Here's the ones we don't. But people trying to find a solution to burying a baby, Christian people coming forward looking for that in Ireland, would have tried to get their baby buried as close to what they saw as blessed ground, but without actually burying them in blessed ground. So there was always that scenario, and there are definite patterns that you can look at. And quite often when we go to a site, you can walk around the site, and plus we can read the landscape when we walk on it. If the land has been disturbed in any way, if it has been dug over, such as Milltown Cemetery, it makes it more difficult to read the landscape when you walk on it. The vegetation will be different over a grave. You will see some areas of land that have not been dug around the grave will all add to the picture. In the spring, for instance, when you get fresh grass seeds and things coming up, you could almost, if you hunker down and look, you'll see the rows of graves, which you won't see when you're standing up and looking down. So there are definite ways that you can walk out and start your investigation and focus your investigation on where it needs to be. But I fully understand what you're talking about.
So my baby brother was born with the original sin, so he couldn't be buried. And then people that commit suicide, that was a mortal sin, so they couldn't be buried in sites as well. Like the cruelty of our past and of religion is still alive and well for all to see. And we're trying to deal with that. But what I'm saying is that I suspect that these are mass graves as well, and it's how do we start dealing with this problem when it is so widespread? It happened in every parish, in the 26 counties, so it happened in every parish in the 6 counties as well, without a doubt, and the scale of it is untold. And I suppose the damage of it is my generation and others are still trying to deal with what what went on. But we can talk about the problem, but how do we actually resolve it in a humane way that gives respect to the dead and what happened to them, in a way that we're not disturbing them either?
You can, we can very, very gently excavate. And when you've got a mass grave, when we did the excavations at Milltown, for instance, we only went down to the presence of the top layer It was not necessary to go any further. If you disturb those graves in any way, you could literally destroy the very thing you're trying to protect. But you follow the archaeology. Once you come upon a grave, you have to follow the direction and see how far does the archaeology actually stretch. You need to identify that, and that needs to be taken very seriously, because some of those 97 Colleen that I discovered in documentation and maps, some of them were just gone by the time I got around to look at them. Somebody's housing estate was over the top of them. And that's exactly what you've got to do. The same thing when you have institutions in the south, for instance, at the moment, where they have been selling large institutions off without identifying where the burials actually are. Planning is saying, yeah, okay, you're selling it, let's put up a block of flats. There's no sort of system of when an institution, an area of institutional building or church is coming up for sale. There has to be something also within the planning permission where they recognise the potential. Mm-hmm. And it's not always only the babies who were buried within the institutions. If you have a home birth, quite often people will come and bury close to a convent because they consider it hallowed ground. So there are possibilities of a Colleen being established outside the boundary that you're not even aware that's there. But archaeologists will know there's a potential for it there. And the team needs to be given, archaeology teams need to be given the chance to go in and establish, is there archaeology here that needs to be taken into consideration or not? If the land is cleared, fine, happy days, away you go. But until that happens, then we continually lose these sites and the babies that are there.
Okay, Claire, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you. Can I ask, does the church seem interested in preserving the sites?
No.
No?
No. Some of the affidavits that I sent into the group actually contain statements where people who were brought in to work, for instance in Milltown Cemetery, were told, we know the babies are all over here, but we've established a car park on it. And we know they go much further. But until the issue is raised, don't deal with it. And everyone was brought to a tiny postage stamp of an area. And 11,000 people were supposed to be buried in this small area, not even remotely. One of the things also is this issue of a lease. If I buy a grave in a council cemetery, I buy a grave in perpetuity. If I buy a grave in a private cemetery, I get a lease. I basically rent the grave for a period of time. Currently, the graves in Milltown Cemetery that are being sold are 75 years. And as the law stands today, they are legally entitled to remove remains and resell the grave, which is where we come back to the private cemetery status.
Sorry, Chair, if I can follow up with that. So I suppose what I'm saying is does the church recognise the wrong insofar as, you know, it's a difficult one because I suppose it's guided by a faith and a religion and what they did, and you know, but surely if they're recognising the wrong, there's maybe an attempt to address it by preserving the graves. And I suppose where I'm really struggling with this is that what they're allowing to happen and continue to happen is horrifying.
It is. What does that say about us as a culture?
That was the church itself.
Exactly.
And what does it say about what they did back then, and whether that's regretful or whether it's not? And I'm concerned about that. And
when I started the research, I had that meeting at Lisburn, and I tried to explain to them at the meeting, look, what has happened in the past has happened in the past. We cannot change what has happened in the past. However, you can do a lot going forward. There has to be recognition, and we're not looking to nail anybody to the wall for this. We're looking for recognition, bring back the land that has the burials, etc. And that was what I thought we had agreed to. But the current actions show me that that's actually not the case. They're quite happy to wait for a decade or two and then sort of turn around and bring out the land again. So while they may be on the face of it very sorry that it happened, I'm not so sure that it's simply they're very sorry that they got caught. It's not still being addressed. The access to records, I know the church have said, the diocese has said that the records from Milltown Cemetery are being digitalised. But we have past managers and gravediggers who said they have massive volumes of missing records. Now, I don't believe they're missing. I just think they're not available. Therefore, if they continue to do what they're doing, unchallenged, they are not sorry for what they've done in the past. And the fact that I know Susan contacted Bishop Noel Traynor when we discovered this land was being disturbed, and he told her it was a long time ago and I've moved on to a different job. So basically washing his hands of that one. That's really not good. It's not a good look for the church. And they could do so much. And I did say to them before, look, you know, this is doable. This is doable. And their constant argument is we don't have land for a new cemetery in West Belfast. They recently sold 73 acres for development. That then is sold, fair enough. I know people need houses, but there's no extra infrastructure here. They could have established a brand new cemetery there, but the money wouldn't have been instant. It would have had to come over a period of time. Instead, they decided to come back to Milltown Cemetery, and the figures that have been quoted to me is they expect to make around 7 to 7.5 million from the resale of new graves in Milltown Cemetery, in land that is already saturated with burials.
Very, very quick, yes or no. Do you think they believe that they need to do what you and others are working towards what they need to do, or does it? Is it against their beliefs, if you like?
I had numerous meetings with the diocese. And one of the most telling ones, a legal representative for the diocese at a meeting informed me, quote, "We are in the business of making money," unquote. And I thought, wow, there was me thought you were in the business of saving souls. But there we go. How wrong can you be?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, Brian, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Tony, for all the information you brought us, which is astonishing and shocking, even though I've heard some of this before, but you're giving more detail, you know, and as I said earlier, about disrespect for the living and the dead, it's about the power of the Roman Catholic Church, the oppression of people, and the neglect by the state, you know, and allowing things to happen, and wrongs that were done in the past, but there's continuing cover-up, and you're trying to shine a light on that, and it's right that you do so. Some knowledge of this through the work of at City Cemetery with Agnes Close and others, the baby plot there,
Yeah.
where infant deaths or early childhood death, I think on the stone it's over 7,000 babies buried in an unmarked plot, and there's now, it's just at least there is a stone recognising the scale and the number of babies buried in that plot at City Cemetery. And I know she and others have done a lot of work, and the council supported that in the end. So the only question I have is regarding then the process for this with the Truth Recovery panel. Were you able to feed into its work, into its interim report? Did they capture what you're saying?
I don't think.
And where are we with a public inquiry into this? Is that, do you
The
feel
only
that
thing
is
we
moving,
have-
or is that just on a shelf? Or?
I think it's moving to a certain extent, but I think, for instance, I've just been informed recently that the baptism register that I got sight of for Marionvale is no longer available. And it's very recently, we had a meeting in December with the Diocese of Down and Connor, and the question was asked by Susan, where are the records kept for Milltown Cemetery? And we were informed that they were kept in an attic of St Peter's Church, and God forbid there's ever a fire. And it beggars belief. And that's what you're facing all the time. It is about control. They have total control, not only over the land, but the information in the records that is so vital for getting a clearer picture of just what has happened in the past. Something has to be done to retrieve the records and keep the hard copies. Because if we don't, there was an incident some years ago outside Milltown where someone passing, there was a skip, and some of the large ledgers, and these are massive ledgers, were actually in the skip. And the lady who saw them had contacted the Andersonstown News at the time, and they did an article, and the cemetery office said, sorry, they were thrown out by mistake. That's exactly the issue that we have here. And it is plausible deniability. If there's no record book in the office that correlates, for instance, to Section D, where we have ethnographic evidence that burials were conducted, how can we argue with that? Let's go in and have a look. Let's go in and take it. LM59 is so far outside the cemetery. There are 2 sections, 2 sides. You can have similar numbers, but they're slightly skewed. So this grave, as it's recorded, if it's in section A, it's beside the motorway. If it's in section B, it's under the Boucher Road. That's how far away it is.
Right. And so just to clarify, Chair, so in terms of the work of the independent panel, you weren't able to present evidence to them?
I spoke to, now let me get it straight, I've got the right one. Sean O'Connell came to see me, and he had some other members with him, and I gave them a lot of information, a lot of this information that you're getting today. And I've pointed them where there is, I believe, other information that I unfortunately can't get access to. I have also spoken to PSNI on some of the issues, especially potentially the issues of moving citizens from one jurisdiction to another. What was the control involved there? How was that traced? How can you track that? So I've done that as well. I really do hope, and I think the Commission will get through a lot, but I would say speed is, to a certain extent, it is important to move fast, because documents just disappear.
And just, well, either from the officials or yourself, Chair, is the public inquiry actually underway then, or?
No, we haven't even been briefed as a committee in terms of the terms of reference for that yet.
So it's not underway formally?
No, but we've been told it's in the legislative programme in terms of the bill that will bring about.
Right.
So.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Welcome.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Would you like to say anything, Susan? You come.
Yeah, I would just like to thank you for speaking to us today, all of you. I would like just to say something on behalf of the families. We need to find our relatives. We need to mark them, that they even existed. You know, we are a group of families, many whose children died, their organs were stripped against their knowledge. They never signed anything for that to happen. Many of them, these infants, were buried in this land that we're talking about, that was sold to the Bog Meadows. And then the Roman Catholic Church used it as a dump, where they were paid from companies to allow skips and landfill on top of these graves. We know the graves are there. We have the research. We have the grave numbers. And all we need as families, they won't give up the records. But Belfast City Council has records through their burial orders, one issued for every single person, infant or adult, who died in the city of Belfast, even when it was Belfast Corporation. So if we can get an independent body to get access to those records, and they can then match up with what the diocese is going to
produce for records,
we will have an exact number of how many people are buried in that cemetery. I'd like to just touch on one more thing, just from a family's point of view. When the Diocese of Down and Connor opened the Upper Poor Ground in the 1970s, the Northern Ireland Environment Agency had to step in and stop them, because there is diseases in that land, and that's why they weren't able to sell any more of it. There is disease in this land, and there is disease in these graves that they have been reclaiming daily, that are 100 years old. And our fear is that they will unleash a pandemic into our community. So that's something I would like the committee to be aware of.
Thank you. Thank you. Really, really strong point to end on. But so thank you so much for your evidence today.
Thank you.
And we always sort of reflect on everything we heard and then chase it up then with the authorities. But thank you for now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, members, just to go through the formalities at the end of the meeting then. So in terms of your draft forward work programme, as I said, I think some of you were maybe missing at the start. So the First Minister and Deputy First Minister are unable to come next week. So we will possibly just have a session looking at the progress that's been made against the first, thank you ladies, first day brief. So Connie and I have been invited for an informal session next week, and we've asked for what the nature of that is, because we would appreciate the meetings to be in a formal setting, so we will keep you posted on that. But just to let you know. Thank you, Ewan. Go ahead, please, Sinead.
Sorry, Chair. They just are not available at that particular time, or is it?
Well, the letter was, I think it was circulated earlier today, and I appreciate you have two committees on a Wednesday, so you maybe haven't seen it yet. Very little information in the letter, just said that they would be keen to come before committee after recess, and that they would like an informal meeting before.
What about the junior ministers? Because we haven't seen them at all.
I know.
As if they don't exist.
I know. Well, I suppose that's what I'm saying in terms of our informal meeting. I will only be attending that, not just speaking for Connie here, but for myself, if there's something very specific around it, because we need to have the scrutiny sessions, the meetings in public session, and it's just very disappointing that we haven't seen. So.
Chair, is it standard that even the junior ministers haven't appeared before the scrutiny committee within a session? You know, are they going against?
Well, I've only been in the chair for a few months, but it's my understanding that it is. Would you like to talk about previous mandates?
I would say it's unprecedented.
Okay, unprecedented. Okay.
Incredible.
Can we reiterate that, given the absence of the First and Deputy First Minister, that, you know, juniors haven't, so maybe they would like to attend? I'm sure you already have. Yes. Yeah.
I think we also, you know, I think this is part of a wider issue from my perspective as well. There was one committee meeting we just did not get departmental papers from, and I think that, you know, it's not really the way to treat the scrutiny committee as well. And I think we would have expected those papers and to see the First Deputy First Minister and the junior ministers as well.
Okay, so we will keep you posted about the potential for a meeting. Sorry, anybody else would like to comment?
No.
No, okay. So potentially next week's meeting will be actually looking at the 100-day goals. So obviously we have 100 days plus 1 month now. But we will be hopefully bringing a report back next week, and we can go through that around every directorate, what they said they should have done, what they should have signed off, what was underway within that first 100 days. So we will do that scrutiny work as a committee next week if we can't get any resolution in terms of other witnesses. Okay, so
I maybe come in, Chair. Just on reflection after those evidence sessions, there were some really, really serious issues that we had discussed there.
Yes.
And as you'd noted, the terms of reference for the inquiry we haven't yet got a briefing on. I think would it be worthwhile if this committee could write to the department and really highlight what was raised with us at committee today, some of the really concerning allegations, and hopefully if we have consensus, stress that we really do think that preservation of these records and also these burial grounds is extremely important, and we would like to see it in the terms of reference if the committee would agree to that.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Okay, moving on, members then. So in terms of correspondence, so just refer you to page 131 of the pack and page 3 of the table pack, the summary of committee correspondence. There's a memo from the clerk of from the Committee for Finance regarding departmental transformation proposals. So I'm just going to seek your agreement for me as Chair to write to the department to seek a copy of the department's transformation proposals. We're in agreement. Okay, I would also draw your attention to page 136 of the pack for a memo from the clerk to the Committee of Finance for the scrutiny of the draft executive budget 2024-25, and again we seek your agreement that I would write to the Committee for Finance to get an update on that committee's scrutiny of the department executive budget. Okay.
It's to write to TEO for departmental.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
For their business plan.
Okay. And then there was just one small piece of correspondence in the table pack, and that was from Community Relations in Schools regarding the delay in good relations funding decisions. And again, just seek your agreement that we write to the department to find out when groups will be getting their letter of offer or confirmation of funding. Okay, anybody else want to raise any issues under correspondence or any other business?
Any other business? I just want to raise the issue of the Ebrington site again, and the management of the Ebrington site. Talk about unprecedented. That there will be just one event on that site this year, after us bringing to the fore the problems with events on the site, and a commitment from the Executive Office to intervene and support events, music events happening. It's going to be worse this year than last year, and it's been a total fiasco, to be honest with you, and it's really bad PR for the city. and for the Ebrington site itself. And the whole process is absolutely, completely wrong. And promoters are pulling out of it. And it's given the site a bad name, where it's really the management of the site that's the problem. And Sister Sledge was meant to be playing there. You know, if it was marketed properly, but it's left to the promoter, and, you know, as if there's no ownership by the Executive Office or Derry City Council to actually get music events and vitalise that site. It's really, really harmful to the city and to the region. Sister Sledge is like a 1970s icon. We are family, lost in music and all of that there. But you know what has been lost? The music has been lost in Derry. And we're suffering as a result of it. And the Executive Office is absolutely culpable in all of this, through absolute no management at all. No matter what process that they put in place, they do it in retrospective. We need to go out into the industry and the sector and pick really good music events and be responsible for the promoting of them, and not leave it to obscure procurement processes, and then they fall away time and time again. If it was happening anywhere else, under any other stewardship, we'd be all up in arms about it, and they've done it again. And I think we need to write to Gareth and those that are looking after that site and ask, what are they doing?
Well, I'm going to bring Patrick in and then we'll respond. Go ahead. Do you want to mention it, say anything in terms of as a local rep for that area?
No, well, I suppose for me, you know, the points that Sinead has made around the promotion of the site are key to this as well. I think that in terms of branding the site, we've now looked at a marked decrease in events as well. So it's imperative that we get the situation where the site is promoted not only regionally but actually internationally as well. Because, I mean, I actually was probably part of the generation that first was able to use those sites growing up. So it was really good to have that space. I think it's really been a chance to reclaim our own city and actually to reclaim a key site in it as well. So it's getting that. But fundamentally, and I think, I suppose what Sinead's said as well to build on that, it's linking up what we're doing through TO and through economy as well, because this is a key site for the city. We can't let it stagnate. We certainly can't let it fail. So it's about this. It's about promoting this as a key part of our tourism, as a key part of growing business and growing industry. So I think it's vital to the city that we do this year.
Thank you. I raised it. Was it last week or 2 weeks ago? Whenever it was first in the on the BBC News website, and I was conscious that there was the potential for a legal challenge. So I didn't say that much whenever the TO officials were here, but we did note that I think we've got our Ebrington site visit in September, possibly
October.
Early October, is it?
It's not set yet. They
Not
have to get
set,
back to us for the dates.
Yeah, but we have that coming up, and hopefully by then some of the legalities around some of the issues have been settled by then, and we can really drill down into this issue. But I'm happy to write in the interim to raise concerns around that, and hopefully we'll get a response.
There's a consultation process going on at the moment as we speak, really, in and around public engagement about what the people want for the site. But there is so much anger at how this has been managed by the Executive Office, and everybody washing their hands of it. It's somebody else's problem. It's somebody else's fault. It's the promoters. It's the procurement process. They're in charge of the procurement process.
Yeah. Okay, no problem. We will draft something. We'll let you see it before. Okay, go ahead.
Just on that, I mean, I'm happy to visit in October, but I did say I don't know if there was anything happening during the summer that's worth visiting. If there was something actually happening on the site during the summer, whether we wanted to visit then.
Right, and there's one event.
There's one event in the whole summer. Right. And it's not Sister Sledge. And it's not Sister Sledge then.
And it's not Sister Sledge because it's going to a warehouse.
Right.
And
okay, well, that makes a point in itself then.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, that's us.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Committee Room 30. Sound. Committee Room 30. Sound.